We're ready to get started.
Yes. All right, we are recording. So happy Friday again, everybody. Welcome to Beyond the Steps. It's Friday, May 21st. I cannot believe we are almost at the end of May. Time is flying. It's great to be back live with all of you. We did an episode replay last week about why studios should embrace dance science with the fabulous Dr. Jeff Russell. We hope you got to watch that. It's living on our Facebook page at Apolla Performance. So if you haven't watched that episode, please check it out. It was so informative, such a wonderful chat. And we rarely get such genius that we do with Dr. Russell. So again, take a look at that. So thank you to everybody joining us here on Facebook Live and here on Zoom. I'm Bree, co-founder and CEO of Apolla Performance Wear, here with my friend, Melissa McDaniel, who is the founder of Turning Point Dance Creations, a dance educator, choreographer, and social justice advocate. Today, we're discussing the pros and cons of having a no-touch policy with student athletes. There's a lot of debate and chatter all over the Facebook pages and the group pages about, people's thoughts and opinions about this topic. And we're going to break it down today on a more granular level. And we're going to present research and information that, for you to consider and see where you fall on this topic. Because, oftentimes we jump and we go, I feel this way. No way could we do that. And often we don't even know what that exactly means. It's just different than what we're comfortable with. So we're going to explain all the ins and outs of having a no touch policy. What does that actually mean? And we're going to hear it from an expert. Before we introduce our expert today, I'm going to give you a few reminders throughout the episode. You're going to see Melissa and me looking around. We are not crazy. We are fielding comments and questions from you guys, not only here on Zoom, but also on Facebook and our friends on Instagram, and trying to bring them into the conversation. We encourage you to please comment, ask your questions. Every Friday, we're having these chats, and it's not just us. We don't want to just hear ourselves. We want to hear from you. We want to hear what's on your mind, the questions that you have, because ultimately we're here to kind of all evolve to a higher thinking and create happier, healthier spaces in dance for everyone, no matter gender, race, ethnicity, body size, whatever. Everybody deserves to have that safe space. So that is why we're here. Learn with us. We're on this journey with you, and no question is silly. We just ask that you be respectful. Finally, please share with your friends, share afterwards. Encourage people to watch this, because the more people can receive this information, the faster we're going to see this industry that we all love evolve again to create those happy, healthy spaces. So Melissa, who do we have with us today?
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to introduce Grace French. She is a classically trained dancer, dance educator, and founder and president of a nonprofit, the Army of Survivors. Army of Survivors is a nonprofit committed to ending sexual violence against athletes through education, advocacy, and resources. Her work in survivors' rights and advocacy for athletes' rights has been globally recognized, leading her to speak at the United Nations General Assembly in 2019. As a survivor of the now defamed Olympic doctor, she is one of the recipients of the Arthur Ashe Courage Award at the 2018 ESPYs, as well as a 2018 Glamour Women of the Year awardee. Grace, oh my gosh, I'm in the presence of greatness today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here with you all.
And you have been awarded some wonderful honors for your work. So we are just so honored to have you here with us. And your courage and your strength has probably created a clear path for many other survivors to tell their story. So we thank you for that. Also, that there's so many other people who have been empowered to use their voice because of you. So you created Army of Survivors to meet a very specific need. Can you tell us what led you to step into that purpose and why it's important to have an organization like Army of Survivors?
Yeah, so a little bit of background, a little bit more than biography. I grew up in the suburbs of Lansing, Michigan, and had a dream of becoming a professional ballerina. But at 12, I was playing Red Rover on the playground and sprained my wrist. And that day, I had gymnastics practices and a couple of performances coming up with my dance company. And so my parents did a logical, which was to ask around for who I should go see. And everybody in the community recommended the now defamed Olympic doctor, content warning, perpetrator name, Dr. Larry Nassar. So from the age of 12 to 19, I saw Larry and was sexually abused at every appointment. I never questioned it because I thought it was osteopathic manipulation that he was doing. So when in 2018, I came forward with about 500 other victims of Larry Nassar, of sexual abuse. And those cases span decades and even sports, from volleyball and soccer to diving, gymnastics, dance. So as we stepped forward as an army to face our perpetrator and those who enabled the abuse as well, we saw cases from other athletes around the world begin to come forward. And we recognized that this was an institutional problem. It wasn't just a problem with one perpetrator or one community. And I also heard from my sister survivors that they wanted to make change and they wanted to feel empowered by the experiences that they had to make sure that nobody else experiences the same thing that we did.
Mm-hmm.
So about 40 of us came together in the beginning to create the Army of Survivors in order to bring accountability, awareness, and transparency to sexual violence against athletes at all levels.
Wow.
Thank you so much for your bravery and stepping forward and sharing your story. Like Melissa said, it's just it's carving out a path for people to step forward and heal and recover, hopefully, and realize that they're not alone in this, because it's happening much more than it should. So thank you for your bravery and for being here today again. Before we get into the questions, I just want to, Grace said this so eloquently, but trigger warning, protect your peace. If you're feeling any particular way about any of the topics, questions, conversations that we're having on the show today, please step away. Again, protect your peace and make sure that you put your feelings and your space, you protect that first and make that a priority. So that the trigger warning again, if you're watching, no hard feelings if you have to step away. So Grace, your website highlights some very staggering statistics. 7% of student athletes are victim of sexual assault, and there are over 3.75 million survivors in the US alone. That is shocking. That is absolutely shocking to hear that such a large number. And we're talking about those are the people that we know about, right? Not even including the people we don't know about. So with these numbers, why do you think an organization like Army of Survivors was not created sooner?
Yeah, I think simply put, we weren't talking openly about sexual violence 20 or even 10 years ago. I think the Me Too movement has really brought greater awareness to sexual violence at all levels from all different intersectionalities, and has given a voice to so many that were not being listened to or who were afraid to speak up because of the backlash and the stigma that used to exist and sometimes still does in some communities, with survivors and victims coming forward with their truth. Additionally, I think the institutions that we are up against when we're talking about protecting athletes are huge, and they have a lot of money and they have a lot of power in these communities, and they profit off of keeping those athletes silent. So the longer those athletes keep their mouths shut, or the longer they have power over them, they can continue to churn out those championships and medals and endorsements and sponsorships, and therefore the power we're up against is huge.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And dismantling all of that is obviously incredibly complicated, but needs to happen. And so again, we thank you for your work with Army of Survivors, obviously very needed. There appears clearly to be a systemic problem in youth athletics. What do you think the root cause that has supported a system that has harmed so many children and young adults? Why is that happening? Why hasn't there been more accountability to this point?
Well, how much time do you have?
Oh, no.
That's frequently a
Yeah.
question, so, right?
I'd say at the simplest level, I believe that athletics and the culture in athletics does not recognize athletes as humans or children first before they're appreciating them as athletes. So it goes athlete first, then child first. But I really think we need to rethink the way that we're approaching athletics as child first, as person first, and then athlete second. So in a recent study done by the World Players Association called the CARE Project, it was found that 69% of athletes were not aware they had rights when they were children in sport. So it's really easy to take advantage of those who don't understand they can demand anything different. So additionally, as athletes, we're taught from a young age that our body is not our own as we enter the studio, the gym, the practice. Our body belongs to the sport and to the coach. And then to your point about accountability, I think it comes down to who would enforce it. Right now, there's not really any type of enforcement method to incentivize studios, competitions, et cetera, to keep kids safe. There's no type of licenses to revoke, or there's no insurance system for studios for any type of abuse. So to me, it really comes down to enforcement.
Yeah, it's a huge problem across the board. And it again, fixing that is not simple, and it's not as easy as it should seem. It's clearly not simple, and we find that week after week after week on the show. So yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's just so sad. It seems so overwhelming
Yeah.
when you say it's just not that simple. And I also think that there's this place as a competitive athlete and a competitive performer where you leave your emotions at the door. And that emotional detachment can lead to not being able to express yourself, or not even being able to process the emotions that you may be feeling when you're being victimized.
Well, and
And
because
taking
as
it
dancers
away.
too, we're
Mhm.
trained to emote and be something else and go into a pretend world, right? That probably helps people escape that a little bit for a minute, which is probably a little bit dangerous as well, because you're not really staying in those feelings and sitting in those feelings. You're able to escape and become someone else on that stage, and become someone else in in the studio when you're rehearsing. And I wanted to your point, Grace, like we all as educators, I think as parents, I mean, there's no dance educator out there that doesn't, the intention is 100% pure. I mean, nobody does this. If you're a dance studio owner, you're not doing this for the money. I mean, that's not, you're in this for the love of kids, the love of dance, hopefully. And as a parent, you want what's best for your kids. So we all get so wrapped up in the end result that I think, and I've been guilty of this. I think, Melissa, we talked about this a couple weeks ago. Like, you just get so wrapped up in the final result
Mhm.
that you forget that that's just a blip in time. And in the long run, in the grand scheme, it doesn't matter. Preserving that child and that child's peace and that child's nurturing and fostering that whole human is really the point, right? But I think we're all guilty of getting so wrapped up in that.
Yeah, including parents.
Yeah.
Everybody
Yeah.
does. So we know this is happening at all levels, Grace: intermediate and entry-level athletics, high school sports, and even just from reading the research on your website, even at the college level. We consider, college level athletes to be young adults.
Yeah.
Do you find that there's an age group when student athletes are more vulnerable to predatory behavior like this than others? And if so, why?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I wouldn't say there's a specific age group, but I would say that at elite levels, at all age groups, there are studies that show that those elite levels are more susceptible to abuse. And I think that has to come with this inherent identity that is connected to sport when you get to that level. And then this combined with the drive of those athletes to continue progressing in their sport, and then having many, many hours of training and power dynamics between student and mentor. So there are drastic differences in the power dynamics between student and mentor as you progress to an elite level, because that perpetrator, and for this conversation I'm just referring to any perpetrator who has access to this athlete, has more leverage to abuse at that point, because they can threaten the athlete's identity, the career of the athlete, and then their physical and mental well-being. So they have much more leverage at an elite level, and that's why I think elite athletes are more susceptible at any age level.
So we asked this when Jerry and Kat were on a few weeks back, and do you think the way that we've set up the education process, I am sure you experience this in gymnastics, I know that we do it in dance, but we're really setting it up for, okay, I'm in a leadership position. You're my student. You don't question me. You don't ask questions. You don't tell me when you're uncomfortable, because that's disrespectful. I'm not saying we intentionally have set it up that way, but that is really how it goes. If a student speaks up against something that they're told to do, or speaks up because they feel uncomfortable, sometimes we can deem that as disrespectful, right? In terms of the student to coach relationship. And so do you think that we need to go back to the drawing board and in our studio cultures and the way we're training training kids to advocate for themselves in that space?
Yeah, a couple of points I heard. First being, I think sports in which children peak earlier have a higher level of abuse, because gymnastics, dance, you are professional at a much younger age than other sports. And so therefore that power dynamic is even worse, because you have the child to adult sort of dynamic there. And then I also hearing the creating spaces where athletes feel that they can use their voice is so important to this subject, because if you don't have an athlete that can, or a dancer that can stick up for themselves and can advocate without negative consequences, when are they ever going to do that? Because they're not going to want to jeopardize their career, jeopardize their friends that they have at the studio, jeopardize the relationship with that mentor. So I hear that loud and clear.
Yeah. And then it's this weird like dance between the old school mentality of like, that's disrespectful. And in my day, we wouldn't have been allowed to do that. But there is a reason, even as, parenting our children now, I have these discussions with my parents all the time and grandparents about like, well, you shouldn't let your so-and-so talk. Well, we're trying to get them to express their voice and find their voice, advocate for themselves and speak and say and understand clearly what their boundaries are as individuals. And it can be a hard thing to do, and it can be daunting because that's a lot of work that we have to go and undo at this point, right? And so it's going to take everybody taking the time and prioritizing that and going, there's a bigger reason for this that's not necessarily monetary, right? Because like money drives all the decisions, and it's really the bottom line. And so we really have to go, even though this isn't going to affect my bottom line, I have to make this a priority because it's what's right.
Yes, absolutely. And Jen on Facebook Live just put this so well. I just love the way she said it. She said, "We demand compliance and call it respect," which is that really puts it in perspective, and it has to make you feel convicted as an educator. Like, oh, okay, just because a child does exactly what I tell them to do doesn't necessarily mean that they respect me. And because I issue commands doesn't mean that I am worthy of respect. It's about the relationship. So we could stay here forever and ever on this topic, but I do want to get to the no touch policy.
Yeah.
Grace, can you explain to us what it actually means to have a no touch policy in place at a dance studio?
Yeah, so having a no touch policy means touch corrections are not allowed. So instead of using your hands to show a dancer how to like put their hip under an a la seconde, you teach them with your hands, showing them here, or demonstrating yourself instead.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Now, I have seen a few times where people have decided that using the back of your hand is a better option than using the palms. And I know, have you ever seen that before?
Grace is like, yeah.
Grace is like, what? Yeah,
I would say that's still touch, but
I would say that's still touch, but they kind of use it as like, I guess there's
doesn't count.
With the back of your hand. So I thought, well, that's not really no touch, but I think that some people for some reason feel comfortable with that more so than actually using the palms. So I wanted to say that to clear up that that's not a no touch policy. So using the back of your hand is not a no touch policy. We're talking about no touch whatsoever in your studio space. So I've been dancing for 38 years, and with what I just said, I have never worked in a studio or been a student in a studio that had a no touch policy. Do you find, and I've been dancing forever, I'm ancient. So do you find that the call for these policies is growing in dance and other youth sports now?
I'm definitely hearing a lot more conversation about it. And I think this right here is more evidence that there is a greater call. There's more want to find out more about what this means and why it's important, which I think is great.
Well, and all of you guys as survivors that step forward, that case made such an impact on the world of youth sports that how can it not be a conversation? How can you look at that and go, this is just an enigma. This doesn't happen everywhere. This is happening. And it just dance, even in the last 2 years, like the amount of people that are being called out for inappropriate conduct with minors and things of that nature is just staggering at this point. So yeah, you guys really paved the way in terms of the conversations happening now, I think.
Thank you. Thank you.
What are some oh, go ahead, Bree.
Oh no, go ahead. I was about to go off on a tangent. Go ahead.
So what are some of the reasons that a teacher or studio owner might consider a no-touch policy?
A really good question. So there was a study done in 2012 that found that 25% of dancers experience post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms.
Okay.
And according to Child Help, studies indicate that 40 to 50% of athletes have experienced anything from mild harassment to severe trauma in sport.
Did you
So
say
I think
40
it's
to 50, Grace?
40 to 50%. Yes. So I think it's important to realize those numbers and realize that the people that you're working with most likely have experienced some type of trauma in their life. And with that in mind, it's important to adjust to those negative impacts that trauma can have on a person. And with high levels of stress that come with trauma, what happens is that the more complex areas of the brain shut down and you go into a primitive sort of survival state. And that survival brain has 4 reactions, which are fight, which is an anger, aggression, reactive violence; flight, which is pulling away emotionally or physically, closing off, not communicating or isolating; freeze, which is being non-reactive, unemotional, or being completely numb; and then fawn, which I'm also hearing in a lot of these conversations, which is avoiding conflict, people pleasing, not saying no, validation seeking, and being extremely unopinionated, which I think is a lot of student dancers. And those reactions become a pattern over time for trauma survivors because they have been responses that have been necessary for them to survive in their past. And because the brain is malleable and use dependent, the situations that cause those responses are widespread. So trauma survivors have an overactive stress response, and touch can exacerbate that, especially for those who've experienced physical or sexual abuse. So it doesn't matter the intent behind the touch, whether that was malicious or not. It just matters how it is feeling to the survivor, and they might not have control over the stress response that happens because it's biological.
That is, I think, the part we need to focus on, right? Is because your intent as the educator might not be bad. We're not saying if you have the urge to reach out and touch your student. I do that. I mean, I'm a hugger. You know what I mean? Just because it feels okay to you, you're not aware of what they're going through. And having this no touch policy, if I'm hearing you right, is a way to preserve, because we don't know what that child might be feeling or experiencing. And so rather than taking the chance of putting them in an uncomfortable position or triggering a bigger reaction in them or triggering their trauma, we're going to not contribute to that. We're going to pull away and make sure we're protecting their space, whether they've been affected or not. Right?
Yeah. So recognizing that there are so many dancers and athletes who have experienced that you have to change the way that you're teaching, because you don't know everything that's going on. And even that athlete may not understand. I started having PTSD symptoms far before I understood that I was going through trauma myself. So it even goes further than the athlete understanding themselves that they've been through abuse.
So what do you say to the educators out there that are like, I've known this student for years. I know I know my students. I have a good relationship. It's fine. Like I know the parents are fine with it. Like how do you address that? What do you say to that?
I hear that, but I think there's still a deeper understanding to trauma that is not connected to that knowing the family, because you know the family, but you know this much of this person's experience. And even if you know, or you think you know everything, you likely don't.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to highlight an aha moment for me and something that Grace said earlier when she was talking about the 4 ways that you respond to trauma. The fawning way is often rewarded in especially the dance industry.
Yes.
Extreme compliance, people pleasing, did I do that right? Lack of, being far less opinionated is actually rewarded. And I think we need to, as educators, understand how that can be very, very detrimental. And when you have a student who does behave like that, it's not necessarily that that's your star student. That could be somebody who is experiencing trauma. So I really wanted to highlight that. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Just because we're on this topic, and I think it's important, there is no governing body, there is no regulatory agency. So how can dance educators and studio directors and even parents get educated on the warning signs and the red flags and things that you may attribute as behavioral issues, really are something greater and bigger and deeper. So how can they get information on that? Because it seems like there's a whole lot of things that people need to be aware of if they're going to be working with student athletes.
I think that's a really good point. And one of the resources that I often refer people to for education, especially for parents, is Darkness to Light. They have an amazing program about warning signs of abuse, how to be trauma informed, and more for parents.
Thank you. We have a comment from, I know, Melissa, we're going to get to the next segment, but Liz Kessler is on Zoom and she says, virtual dance has shown us that we can accomplish teaching without touch. Absolutely. This year has shown us so much that we didn't think was possible before. Nobody thought we were going to be able to handle this virtual thing for very long. And here we are, we've been doing it for a year, right? And good has come out of that as well. So, and then we have, Jen Cower again with a great comment. Yes, so many kids don't realize until they get older and get more perspective on what is happening to them. So thank you both for your comments and for participating today. It's fantastic. There has been, if you're just joining, I'm Bree with Apolla with Melissa McDaniel. This is Beyond the Steps. We're chatting with Grace French, who is a classically trained dancer. She's also the founder of Army of Survivors. We're talking about today, what are the pros and cons of a no-touch policy working with student athletes. So as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, there's been a lot of talk about this issue on various dance teacher groups on social media, and there's, as always, a clear divide. So what are the downfalls, or are there downfalls of a no-touch policy?
I had to think a little bit hard on this one. And the one thing that I came up with is tactile learners. So if you have a student who's extremely tactile and has to understand things with touch, that might be a challenge. The other challenge that I thought of was retraining teachers. So I'm hearing a lot of, this is how I have grown up. This is how I was taught. So obviously that's how I'm going to teach my kids. But a lot of what we have to do is re-educate that there are ways to communicate through other experiences and auditory communication that can get you to the desired result. It's just a little bit harder, and that's okay. We just have to be okay with having a hard time at first.
Well, and we're creative people. We can figure that out. I'm sure we can find a way to overcome pretty much anything. If we made it through 2020, we can certainly figure out how to implement a no touch policy in our studio spaces.
Right, exactly. And to your point, it's a little bit harder. And I think that that's where the rub is going to be with a lot of people. Well, it's so much easier to fall back into what you know. And you already have a lesson plan, and it says you do this, and it says you do this, and and you've always gotten results from that. But we have to understand that we probably have to take a few steps back if we are going to institute policies like this and establish them, because there's going to be a learning curve for us.
Well, and to give yourself grace and give your faculty grace, because we're not going to get it right 100% of the time, especially at first. But the fact that you're taking the steps and you're trying and you're putting forth the energy and you're recognizing, look, this is an important issue. I think that's the bigger picture, right? And knowing that we're working on it, and that's step one.
So do you think, Grace, that not the back of the hand model, but a hybrid model. So a hybrid model where consent from the student is paramount. So basically it kind of gives them permission to opt in or out of a physical touch policy. Do you think that still poses the same possible issues? Do you think that that's a middle ground that we may be able to take, or what are your thoughts on that?
So I do think that incorporating consent into any touch of the studio is incredibly important, whether or not you have a no touch policy or a hybrid model. But I think it's important to consider power dynamics when you're thinking about hybrid model, because if you're creating an environment where, like we mentioned before, those dancers or athletes don't feel like they have the voice to speak up, then they're not going to feel comfortable saying no. And that hybrid policy basically does not exist anymore if they don't have their voice and they don't have that power. So really creating an environment first and a culture first where athletes feel that they have a voice and are empowered would be crucial in having a hybrid model work the way that it's supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm totally going to go off on a tangent here for a little bit, Bree, I'm sorry. But we talked about earlier, there's no governing body. We always say that over and over again. There's no like real checks and balances in place.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other hard thing about possibly coming forward is, who do you come forward to?
Yep.
Like there's really no place to go. Do you see that in doing this work, Grace, on the horizon? Do you see a reporting structure coming, or do you think there's talk of that, or even the possibility, like, is that even something that can even be done in this industry?
That's a really good question. I know that with governing bodies under USOPC, they have safe sport now. But I think with dance, because there is no like NGBs or organizations that are independent oversight, it would be harder. And I think that's where a lot of organizations are struggling, is how can we organize as dance educators, as dance studio owners, in order to support something that could be created. I know there's a lot of conversation around enforcement and how to make sure that that there are incentives to keep kids safe, that there are incentives to make sure that those dancers in environments that they're in are safe for them. And I think a reporting structure is incredibly important, and hopefully comes about soon.
Well, and in the meantime, we have some really great organizations that are doing work to facilitate improvement in these areas. The Dance Safe, I think it's the dancesafe.org or the Dance Safe on Instagram. You can follow them. They have really, really great resources. They've assembled an amazing team. We have Speak Your Truth Worldwide, which was Sierra Lauren formed that group, and they're doing the work. And of course, our friend Jerry Brown at Dance Equity Association and Liberate Dance Artists, again, doing a lot of great work to propel the industry forward in a lot of these ways and the thinking. So you can find all of those people, just look them up on Instagram. They're doing great work. And again, that's the Dance Safe, Dance Equity Association, and Speak Your Truth Worldwide are three great organizations to check out. And of course, armyofsurvivors.org.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Liz in Zoom said it's very interesting because I'm very much a no-touch teacher, and others have told me that I need to physically correct my students more, but it's just unnatural to me. And that's true. I think that there is a myth or a idea that if you are in a no-touch situation or you've established a no-touch policy, that your students may not be trained as well, or that's what you need to be doing, a requirement. And I think that's kind of just breaking the stereotype.
Yeah.
We have to move forward there.
And since we have time, I'm just going to ask another question, because this is Grace, props to you for being succinct with your answers and being super clear and crisp with all of your answers, because now we have time to just ask you more questions.
Yes, I love it.
But let's talk about a situation where a student athlete comes forward to say they felt uncomfortable with a correction or a physical correction or an adjustment that was made. But as a dance educator, your intention was not to hurt them. And it was not, you didn't have that on your mind. You didn't know. How do you address it without dismissing or invalidating that student's concerns and still making them feel heard and safe?
Yeah, this is important. And I think it's really necessary here to talk about intent versus impact. And what we've said before is, even if your intention is pure, the impact on the dancer is what matters the most, because in order to move forward in a way where they feel as if they were heard, you have to acknowledge that impact that it made. Because if you don't acknowledge and apologize for the impact, they are not going to feel safe coming forward about potential other negative impacts that have happened to them outside of dance even. So how do you, what I would say first is to acknowledge impact, apologize, and then talk through what would be more comfortable in the future for other corrections similar, and ask them how you can adjust to make sure that they feel safe and supported in their environment.
And it's better, obviously, to address that immediately, not waiting until, after class or something, and really just addressing it the moment the concern is brought to you.
Yes.
And resisting the urge clearly to react defensively, because I know that's probably a natural instinct that happens when you're not, that's not what I meant. I didn't,
I didn't
of course not.
Right.
But try to realize that you put yourself in their shoes and react with empathy and take accountability for it, even though you didn't mean it, to be harmful.
Yeah, and understanding the power that you have in that moment, because if you the way you react in that moment can potentially impact the way that they move forward in the world with other negative impacts as well.
I have a question. We're talking about no touch student teacher to student. What do you say to student to student? My students like to partner stretch each other. They like, how does that dynamic work? Because there isn't necessarily a power dynamic there, but that could, trigger.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to acknowledge that not all violence in sport is teacher coach to athlete. It is also between athletes, it's between trainers, doctors, etc. So with that, I would institute a policy around consent, extreme, making sure that students understand the language that they can use in order to do partner stretching, in order to talk through that partner stretch. Am I going too far? How does this feel? Are you feeling okay still? To make sure that they're not overstretching each other, because that can be extremely bad as well. Yes.
Right. So one last question, and then we'll get to the homework. You and Elizabeth, as you were saying intent versus impact, Elizabeth Kessler was on Zoom typing intent versus impact. So that was just really funny.
Thank you.
So yay.
Jen on Facebook, real quick, Bree. Jen over on Facebook is exactly where I am. She said, because of how I grew up, I started teaching. Start teaching, and sometimes I touch correct without thinking about it first. It takes time to get out of it, and those habits are going to come up. So like Bree said, grace, give yourself some grace. Also make sure you're pushing forward if you choose to put this policy in place.
And thank you for just being honest and sharing that, because I am guilty of it. Melissa, I mean, we just, that's a different time. And again, when you know better, you do better. So now that we know better, what are we doing to kind of take steps forward? And that's what this show is all about. So, okay, I'm a dance studio owner. And I've been teaching a way, or a director or an educator, all of the above, but I've been teaching a certain way, and I have the power to implement a no touch policy in my studio. So bam, that this is a new policy. I've had my faculty meeting. Ideally, we would want to see some training in there to make sure everybody understands why we're having this policy, and that it's not just this rule that goes, unobserved half the time, but you really want to enforce this, implement this. And you've had this studio culture this way for X amount of years, but now we implement this no touch policy. How do we communicate that to everybody without making it this awkward, bright shining spotlight? Or do we shout it from the rooftops that, look, this is the position that I'm taking with my studio. We're proud of it. Come on in, and this is what you're going to get. Or, how do you breach that with the parents that have been there for years who are used to a certain way?
My policy with this would always be complete transparency and shouting it from the rooftops, because in order for this to work, everybody has to be on the same page as to why it's happening first, understanding the importance of a no touch policy, understanding the decision and how you got to that point first, and then being transparent with those who are still at the studio and those who may be coming into the studio as well. But also, I think there's and accountability and enforcement that I'm hearing you say as well, which is you got to make sure that if you're putting this in place, that you're enforcing it, that you're taking accountability, giving yourself grace, but also taking accountability towards those breaks in policy, and making sure that you're addressing them and acknowledging them with the students, with the classes, with the teachers, etc.
Well, yeah, because oftentimes teachers are independent contractors, and you may be on this road and be enlightened and have this understanding, but you can't be in that room with especially if you're at a larger organization, you have a larger faculty, you can't be in the room 24/7 with each teacher. And so you really, really have to make sure that they understand why this is going in place.
Exactly. And giving them the tools to change the way that they have taught for so long, I think is super important as well. I know you mentioned training, but really making sure that they understand alternatives. Because if a teacher walks into a space only knowing one way to communicate a correction, and they don't have the tools to make adjustments, I think it's going to be a lot harder for them to acknowledge and accept this policy, rather than if you give them the tools, they'll be able to, I think, adjust more accordingly.
Absolutely. Thank you. We have a couple of comments on Facebook and Zoom, Melissa. Do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. So Casey on Facebook mentioned maybe tools like relative motion experience, at relative motion experience is the handle here, probably a Facebook or Instagram handle, are amazing for no touch correcting. So
they're the leggings that have the panels that wrap around certain that focus and wrap around certain muscle groups, and the pants visually help kids identify those muscles and use those muscles. And they just launched a year ago, 2 years ago, I don't remember, but Jamie Goodwin, who's a professional dancer, and her sister Kara Goodwin developed this program and these amazing leggings, and they have these great technique classes, and they're part of our Insta Live on a monthly basis, but they also have their own IG Live classes. So definitely check them out. Thank you, Casey, at the Relative Motion Experience.
Oh my God, that's perfect.
Yeah.
You can identify, okay, the red area or the area that, wow, that is.
Yeah. And it just it's a great visual. The way that they have these leggings laid out it's fantastic. They did a good job.
Awesome. And then Liz, when I was in grad school where I had accommodations, I told one of my instructors that I would not be able to do the partnering work one particular day. And she said, sure, but you won't be able to get a grade for today. Talk about a power dynamic.
Wow.
I was in my 20s and didn't know what to say to that because of the power dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
It's so much worse with kids. And that's very true.
It's especially in this culture that we have, this social media driven culture where, everyone's a celebrity, and you're like, if I just get them to talk to me, it's going to take me to the next level. I mean, and it's not just kids that feel this way. It's parents that see that who don't know better, because they're, again, just trying to do what's best for their kid, and they don't know. So they're like, this person is famous. And, the power that gives that instructor is so crazy. And that's, I think, why we're seeing so much abuse of power happening now, is just we've had this celebrity culture now for a handful of years, and it's just gotten more and bigger and crazier.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Homework.
We got homework. Thank you. There's so much great insight, and we got through all of our questions plus some. And again, thank you, Grace, for all the information. So we like to give homework on the show. Immediate action. What is one thing that you want everybody watching to work on this week? One step they can take between now and our show next week, 7 days, to make improvement and progress in terms of understanding and maybe even implementing a no-touch policy.
I think first, before the one step that I would like you all to take, I would like to plug the website for my organization, because I do think there are wonderful resources on there that do a really good job of describing the science behind trauma, so that you can deeply understand what trauma survivors are going through, to better understand why this is important. And we are at thearmyofsurvivors.org. I think the step that you can take between now and next week is to do some more research on the prevalence of abuse in sport, to really understand why this happens and how many people this is have been affected by this. Take time to reflect on that and realize how you can implement different policies. No Touch is an example of one of them, to make sure that trauma survivors are safe, that all athletes are safer in these environments that have those extreme power dynamics.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I just had this thought, but before you take the step to implement it, I'm not saying don't implement it, but if you're like on the ledge and you're afraid your toe is like off and you're like, I'm afraid to really go forward and what that means and take that dive, can't you just start with your classes? You don't even have to tell anybody that you're doing it, but just start doing it and see. Maybe it's not as hard as you think it's going to be to implement a no touch policy. Maybe you can do it. And when you're ready and you feel more confident in that, then you take the next step. But don't you think that that's possible, or is that not the right way to look at it?
I totally agree. And like someone mentioned, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the commenter's name, but we already did this as dance educators. We've been doing this for a year. So trying implementing it in person, use the same language you were using over Zoom, think about it that way.
That's actually a great way to think about it. So, in addition to visiting the armyofsurvivors.org and really learning about trauma and the impact of trauma on survivors and why we're talking about a no touch policy today, take little steps, go into class and see if you can get through a whole class period with a no touch policy in your own mind. You don't even have to advertise it, just do it and see how easy it is. It may not be as hard as you think. We also want to encourage you to take our Steps 2020 initiative course. This is a 4-part virtual course series. It's actually more now, but it's going to tackle topics like racism, gender inequity, sex abuse and prevention, dance medicine and science, nutrition, integrative dance, and more. But there are just modules that you can take on your own time. Each course was donated by leading experts in each field, and it's completely free to you. We incur the expense of maintaining the course, but Melissa's going to pop the link here into the chat on Zoom and Facebook so that you can take that course. You can go at your own pace. And again, this is by no means all the information you need, but it will give you a base solid foundation to be able to move forward in your own journey and your own education and some resources to help you do that. So again, that's the Steps 2020 initiative, completely free, and you can take that at your own pace starting today. We also encourage you to look into getting your studio YPAD certified. Our friends at Youth Protection Advocates in Dance are doing great work to keep kids happy, healthy, safe, and dance, and certifying studios and now conventions and competitions to be YPAD certified, meaning that they are safe spaces for dancers. So, and they have to go through a very rigorous certification process to get that. It's not something that everybody just gets handed. They have to do the work. And so again, encouraging you to visit them at ypad.org. We're also going to pop the link in the chat for 25% off a certification. So there's a link that you can get certified. And if you enter Apolla, all caps, APOLLA 25 at checkout, you'll get 25% off that certification. So it's a nice little savings for you. And again, I want to just say one more time, you want to visit the armyofsurvivors.org and also check out the Dance Safe, Speak Your Truth Worldwide, and our friends at DEEA.org, right? I always forget the other E, but Dance Equity, Dancers Equity Association. So check them out. And thank you so much, Grace. This was really great.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me. It was lovely to be here.
Yes, it has been absolutely amazing to have you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to everyone who was watching and who hung in there with us and who commented and just made this conversation even more robust. There's, of course, more and more that we can talk about, and we love to hear follow up to this. If you are an educator who's trying it, like Bree said, who's tried it one class, come back and comment and let us know how it's going and what you've learned and what your learning is. This is a learning community as much as it is a listening community and a discussion community. We want to learn from each other as much as we possibly can.
And maybe we can have Grace back and do like a follow-up chat.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We already have requests. Elizabeth Kessler is asking, can we please bring you back? So yes, we will absolutely bring her back.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Bree, for being here today with me again this Friday. as always, we have just decided to take this journey and run with it. And it's just been an absolute pleasure. So thank you so much. Anybody who's out there watching on Facebook, anybody who is here on Zoom can watch this episode and share it as much as they possibly can and want to. Go back to Apolla Performance on Facebook, and it's under the video section. Just click that little share button and you can share it to any of the dance teacher groups that you're with. You can share it with your parent population, your teacher population, however it is that you want to share it. Also on Instagram at TPDC_on_IG. There's a link in the bio that has all of the episodes in a YouTube playlist. So you can also see all of the episodes there, including this one. So thank you so much for joining us. Next week is Memorial Day weekend. We are taking some time to be with our friends and family on that weekend, also just to pay some honor to those who have sacrificed and made the greatest sacrifice of their life for protection of our country and the people who are in it. So we will be doing a replay next week, and that replay is one of my favorites. Dr. Bonnie Robson and Jackie Haas.
That was a good one. It was a good one.
It was a good one. Are going to talk about how do we identify and mitigate stress on competitive dancers. So that replay will be going up at 2 p.m. Eastern time next week. Same time, same place, just a little bit of a replay, a little bit of a flashback. So thank you. We hope that you can join us there. We will be back live on the next week. So catch us there. And until then, we hope that you continue your journey beyond the steps.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you.
Thank you so much.